Rest now, let your body grow calm, and let the quiet gather around you. In the stillness, we'll drift softly into the quiet mystery of birds falling from a winter sky. If you find rest here, subscribe, and a new one will be ready each night. Something landed on the roof of a house in Beebe, Arkansas, in the last minutes of December 31st, 2010, and the sound was not what anyone was expecting. It was heavy. It came in clusters, a pause, then several impacts in quick succession, then another pause, and then more. Not rain, which would have been steady and fine, not hail, which would have been louder and more uniform. Something solid was striking the shingles and the gutters and the hoods of cars parked in driveways, and the residents of Beebe who were still awake at that hour, most of them waiting for midnight, began to move toward their doors and their windows to find out what it was. Beebe sits in White County in north-central Arkansas, a city of roughly 5,000 people in flat agricultural country where the land opens wide on every side and the winter sky on a clear night runs all the way to the horizon without interference. It is the kind of place where unusual sounds at night carry easily across the neighborhood, where a thumping on one rooftop draws someone out of 2 or 3 other houses at the same time, where the accounts of witnesses end up being strikingly similar, simply because the witnesses were close together and all of them could hear it. December 31st that year was a cold night, clear enough, with the ordinary sounds of a small city on New Year's Eve. Fireworks going off at intervals in several directions, voices from nearby houses, the distant bass of celebrations that had started hours before. What began arriving on the rooftops of downtown Beebe just after 11:30 was different from all of that, heavier, more specific, coming from above. The people who went outside found the streets covered in birds. They were red-winged blackbirds, mostly. Small, dark-feathered birds, the kind common across the whole of the southern and central United States in winter, the kind that gathers in enormous communal roosts in the wetlands and river bottomlands at the edges of agricultural country. They were scattered across the pavement and the grass and the hoods and roofs of parked cars in a radius that extended in all directions from the center of the city. Some of them were clearly dead. Others were alive but unable to move properly, sitting in place with their wings held at odd angles, occasionally making short, uncertain movements against whatever surface they had landed on. The streets were quiet, except for the continued distant sound of fireworks and the low, irregular sounds of birds that had not yet died. One of the people who stepped outside in the first minutes of that night was Robbie King, who lived in the affected part of Beebe, and whose account was later quoted widely in news coverage of the event. She described going to her front door and seeing birds on her car, on the hood and the roof and the trunk, and on the ground around the vehicle, and across the road in both directions. Some of them, she noted, were still moving when she first went outside. Their wings were working, slowly, against the metal of the car, the shallow, effortful movements of animals that had sustained injuries they did not yet know were fatal. She stood in her doorway in the cold and looked at them for a moment before going back inside to call someone. The calls went to neighbors first, and then to local emergency lines, and by midnight there were enough reports coming in from enough addresses that it was clear this was not a single household's experience. The birds were down across a broad stretch of central Beebe, in numbers that were difficult to count in the dark, but that even early estimates placed in the thousands. Some rooftops had clusters of carcasses gathered in the valleys between shingles. Some stretches of pavement were dense with them. By the time the first hours of January 1st had passed and the night had quieted, the scale of what had happened was becoming visible in the cold air, and the glow of porch lights, and the city of Beebe was waiting for morning to understand it. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission received formal notification in those first hours, and commission officials arrived at the site before sunrise. What they found in the low light of early January 1st was a scene that required careful measurement before it could be described with any accuracy. Birds were distributed across the pavement and grass and rooftops of roughly a 1-mile radius around downtown Beebe. They lay singly and in small groups, on lawns and in gutters, and on the flat roofs of commercial buildings, and under the low branches of ornamental trees. The streets were otherwise quiet, the celebrations of the previous night thoroughly over, the city still, the only sounds the soft crunch of an official's footsteps moving carefully between carcasses, and the occasional low wind through the power lines overhead. The commission officers began systematically counting and collecting carcasses through the morning, working outward from the densest concentrations. By the time the initial collection was complete, the count stood at approximately 5,000 individual birds within that 1-mile radius. 5,000 red-winged blackbirds gathered from the streets and lawns and rooftops of a small Arkansas city on the first morning of a new year. Gem. The figure was precise enough to be taken seriously, large enough to constitute a significant event by any measure, and strange enough to attract the attention of agencies far beyond the state. The response that assembled in the following days was multi-agency and methodical. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, which had jurisdiction over wildlife mortality events in the state, coordinated with USDA Wildlife Services and the Arkansas Livestock and Poultry Commission on the field investigation. Carcasses were preserved and packaged for submission to the USGS National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin, whose pathologists were equipped to perform the kind of detailed examination that a field inspection could not provide. The question being asked at every level of the investigation was the same. What had killed 5,000 birds in a single night in a small Arkansas city, and was it something that posed a risk to anything else? The initial examination of carcasses in the field provided the first important piece of information. There were no external injuries visible on the birds that would have indicated predator attack. No lacerations, no tooth marks, no signs of the kind of damage that a hawk or a cat or any other predatory animal would leave on a kill. The feathers were intact. The external appearance of the birds was, in most cases, unremarkable. Whatever had killed them had not come from outside. The necropsies performed at the USGS National Wildlife Health Center in Madison were more revealing. Wildlife pathologists working on the collected carcasses in the first week of January found consistent evidence of internal hemorrhaging, bleeding within the body cavities, concentrated around the breast muscles and internal organs in the specific pattern that results from rapid deceleration and blunt impact. Under a good light, the breast tissue of individual birds showed the distinctive purple discoloration of bruising and hemorrhage beneath feathers that showed no external damage at all. The internal organs in many carcasses showed the kind of damage associated with sudden high-velocity impact, the shock of a body hitting a hard surface very fast. The bones in some carcasses were fractured. The keel bone, the ridge of bone running along the center of a bird's chest that anchors the flight muscles, showed fractures in several specimens, consistent with frontal impact against a solid surface. What the pathologists did not find was, in some respects, as informative as what they did. There was no organ discoloration or tissue damage of the kind associated with poisoning. There were no neurological lesions. The gastrointestinal tracts of examined birds showed no evidence of toxic ingestion. The livers were normal in color and appearance. The examination produced no evidence of disease. None of the lesions or abnormalities that an avian viral or bacterial infection would produce. The feathers and skin showed no evidence of exposure to caustic chemicals or irritants. Toxicological screening on tissue samples returned results that were, across every category tested, negative. The screens covered organophosphate and carbamate pesticides, rodenticides of the anticoagulant type, heavy metals including lead and mercury, and avian influenza, the last of these a particular concern given its potential public health implications. Every result came back clean. The toxicology form from the USGS National Wildlife Health Center, with its columns of screened substances and their detection thresholds, returned nothing. The negative space of those results was, in its own way, a substantial finding. It removed every class of explanation that would have required an external agent, a substance applied to the landscape, a pathogen spreading through the flock, a contamination event. It directed the investigation firmly toward a mechanical cause. The combined findings, internal hemorrhage at impact sites, fractured bones concentrated at the keel and breast, clean toxicology, no pathogen, no external injuries, were consistent with one explanation and with very few others. The birds had died from blunt force trauma. Individually, each one had struck something hard at speed, not a predator, not a poison, a surfeit. The conclusion reached by the coordinated investigation, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, USDA Wildlife Services, the Arkansas Livestock and Poultry Commission, and the USGS National Wildlife Health Center was that the birds had been startled into flight by New Year's fireworks. The red-winged blackbirds roosting in the area around Beebe had been disturbed by the noise and light of the fireworks displays that were occurring throughout the city in the hour before and around midnight. Startled from their roost, they had taken to the air in large numbers in the dark. Disoriented in the darkness, unable to navigate with accuracy through an urban landscape of buildings, utility poles, road surfaces, and wire, they had collided with structures throughout the city. Thousands of individual impacts, at the speeds a panicked bird in flight will reach, had produced the internal hemorrhaging and skeletal damage that the pathologist found on the examination table in Madison. The birds had not been poisoned. They had not been struck by lightning or microwave radiation or any other emanation. They had flown, in the dark and in fear, into solid things, and the injuries from those collisions had killed them. The precision of that conclusion took several days to reach and required the contributions of multiple agencies working in parallel. But the conclusion, once reached, was straightforward in the way that physical explanations usually are. The evidence pointed in one direction. The pathology was consistent. The toxicology was clean. The timing aligned exactly with the peak of the fireworks activity, the night of the year when the most and the loudest fireworks would be launched in the most locations across the city simultaneously, producing the most concentrated and sustained disturbance to any birds roosting in or around the city limits. There is a particular quality to the night that Robbie King stood in her doorway and watched the birds on her car. The street was lit by porch lights and the glow of a street lamp at the corner, the kind of amber-orange light that casts the objects in its reach into familiar shapes but leaves the distances dark. Her car in the driveway and the birds spread across it would have been within that amber light. The birds beyond the car and down the road and across the neighbor's lawn would have been at the edge of visibility, their shapes distinguishable from the pavement only by their slight irregularity. The way a dead bird's silhouette against a flat surface has a softness to it that is different from a stone or a leaf. Some of them were moving in those first minutes. The slow wing movements of injured birds, Not the purposeful beating of a bird in flight, but the involuntary diminishing movements of animals in shock against the hood of the car, against the cold metal. She went inside to make her calls, and the night continued, and by morning the birds on the car were still, and the temperature in Beebe was in the low 30s, and the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission was already working its way through the neighborhood with collection bags. The investigation that followed that night was a good example of how the formal machinery of wildlife mortality response is supposed to work. Multiple agencies, overlapping expertise, a division of labor between field collection and laboratory analysis, toxicological screening conducted at a facility with both the equipment and the reference data to interpret the results. The timeline from event to conclusion was compact. The necropsies were completed, and the findings reported within the first 2 weeks of January. The cause of death was established with sufficient certainty that the investigating agencies were comfortable making a public statement attributing the mortality to blunt force trauma from fireworks-induced disorientation, and the statement was made. The pathology itself, when read in the language of what the examination found and did not find, is a kind of quiet document: hemorrhage beneath intact feathers, fractured keel bone, clean liver tissue, no lesions, no pesticides, no pathogens. The report of the wildlife pathologist working through a carcass under good light in a laboratory in Madison, finding the same pattern repeated across specimen after specimen, the precise bruising of impact, the same fracture pattern, the same clean toxicology, is the kind of work that is unglamorous and extremely useful. It transforms a night of strange sounds on rooftops in a small Arkansas city into a fact, confirmed and documented, that can be filed and reported and compared against the next event and the event after that. What happened in Beebe on the night of December 31st was resolved. The birds died from blunt force trauma sustained in the dark, in flight, against the structures of a city they could not see clearly enough to avoid. The fireworks were the cause, and the cause was specific, and the evidence was clean. 5,000 dead birds in a 1-mile radius, and every one of them carrying in its breast tissue the precise bruised signature of a collision. Nothing more complicated than that, and nothing more uncertain. In the days that followed, the streets of Beebe were cleared. The carcasses were collected and removed and disposed of by the commission and by city workers, and by the 2nd or 3rd day of January, the pavements and lawns were clear again. The cars in the driveways had been cleaned. The street at the end of Robbie King's Road looked like any street in any small Arkansas city in early January, cold and flat and quiet in the winter light, with no remaining trace of what had been distributed across it 4 or 5 days before. The laboratory in Madison completed its work on the collected specimens and filed its findings. The toxicology report, with its long columns of screened compounds and their uniformly negative results, joined the necropsy summaries in the case file. The case file joined the database. The event was recorded and categorized and assigned a cause, and the record moved forward. The night itself, the sound of something landing on the roof, the cold air when the door opened, the birds on the car still slowly moving their wings, was already becoming a memory by the time the commission filed its final report. Robbie King had gone back inside. The fireworks had stopped. The streets of Beebe had gone quiet in the particular way that New Year's Day streets go quiet. The celebrations finished, the year officially turned, the city settling into the ordinary cold of a January morning, somewhere to the east and south of the city, in the wetlands and river bottomlands of northeastern Arkansas, where the flooded rice fields and the river margins hold the winter roosts of hundreds of thousands of birds. The red-winged blackbirds that had not been roosting in the city that night were already awake and moving in the early light, feeding in the fields as they had fed every morning that winter and every winter before it. The loss of 5,000 birds from a population counted in the tens of millions would not register in any behavioral change, would not alter the movement of the flocks, would not leave a visible gap in the stream of wings flowing into a bottomland roost at dusk. The event was complete. The cause was known. A wildlife pathologist in Madison closes the last folder of necropsy notes from the Beebe collection. The findings across the specimens are consistent. Hemorrhage at the breast, impact fractures at the keel, toxicology clean across every screened category. The report will be filed in the morning. The cause of death is blunt force trauma, acute, consistent with high-velocity collision with a hard surface, with no evidence of toxic, infectious, or environmental contributing factors. The pathologist sets the folder down on the desk and turns off the lamp over the examination bench. Outside the laboratory windows in Madison, it is the first week of January, cold and very still, and the sky over Wisconsin is entirely dark. That is all the case required. Not an absence of an answer, but the presence of one. Not something left open in the files, waiting for a better explanation, a precise physical account of what had happened to 5,000 birds on a New Year's Eve in a small Arkansas city, written in the internal evidence of their own bodies, and confirmed by the clean, quiet columns of a toxicology report that found nothing where nothing was supposed to be found. The hemorrhage was specific, the fractures were consistent, the toxicology was clean. The investigation closed, and the record stood, and the streets of Beebe went on being streets, cold and ordinary in the first January light. The U.S. Geological Survey maintains an official threshold for what counts as a reportable wildlife mortality event. 5 animals. 5 or more individuals of a species considered of concern, or any number at all, when the cause is unknown and may indicate something broader, a pathogen, a contaminant, a shift in the landscape that has not yet been identified. 5 ducks found dead on a pond in Wisconsin, and 5,000 blackbirds found across the streets of a small Arkansas city fall, by this definition, into exactly the same administrative category. They are both events. They are both entered into the same kind of form, assessed by the same investigative framework, and filed in the same system. The threshold does not ask how strange the event was or how many people witnessed it. It asks only whether the number clears a minimum and whether the cause demands attention. That threshold, quiet, procedural, easy to overlook, is the beginning of a much longer story about how the natural world is watched. It represents a decision made at some point in the history of wildlife biology that mortality events were worth tracking, not only when they were spectacular, but when they were merely present, merely happening somewhere, with or without anyone to notice them. The threshold is set low on purpose. A pond, a small number of birds, a Tuesday in October with no one around. That too is worth recording. That too belongs to the record. The Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center is based in Madison, Wisconsin, in a facility that has been operating since 1975. Its work involves the kind of sustained institutional attention that does not produce dramatic results on most days, but produces over decades something more useful than drama, a baseline, a sense of what is ordinary. Without that accumulated record, there is no way to know whether any given event is unusual or routine, whether a particular cause of death is increasing or holding steady, whether a species is declining in a way that matters, or fluctuating in a way that has always been within its normal range. The center exists to build and maintain that kind of knowledge, and it does so not through a single landmark study or discovery, but through the patient, continuous work of logging events, examining specimens, and keeping the record current. One of the tools the center maintains for this purpose is a database called the Wildlife Health Information Sharing Partnership Event Reporting System. The name is long and ungainly, which is perhaps why the system is almost always referred to by its abbreviated name, WHISPERS. Within that system, reports arrive from a wide range of sources: state wildlife agencies, tribal wildlife managers, federal land management offices, and members of the public who encounter a dead or dying animal and take the time to file a report. Each entry contains the basic facts: the species involved, the location, the date, the number of animals affected, and, where it has been determined, the cause. The result, accumulated across decades, is an archive that is less like a dramatic register of disasters and more like a long, quiet ledger, a record of the ordinary and the extraordinary, mixed together in proportions that reflect the actual character of the world, rather than the character of news. A researcher querying that system on any given afternoon might scroll through entries from dozens of states, each row representing some specific place and time where something happened to an animal or a group of animals, and most of those entries would be entirely unremarkable outside of their local context. A handful of Canada geese found dead along a reservoir in Nebraska, their deaths traced to a bacterial infection common in warm, shallow water. A group of white-tailed deer found in a Pennsylvania woodlot, their condition consistent with hemorrhagic disease spread by midges during a late summer warm period. A colony of little brown bats in Vermont with visible signs of white nose syndrome. Each entry is specific. Each entry was filed by someone who went to a place, examined animals, and took the time to record what they found. The database does not call attention to any single row over another. It simply holds the record, open and searchable, available to anyone who wants to look. The physical evidence that distinguishes one kind of mass mortality event from another begins at the necropsy table, and what a trained pathologist looks for in the body of a small bird tells a story that is more precise than most people would expect from something so small. The external condition of the carcass is the first chapter: feathers intact or damaged, eyes clear or clouded, beak and nares free of discharge or not, feet and legs without obvious abnormality. None of this is conclusive on its own, but all of it is informative, and a pathologist examining a bird that has died from blunt impact will often find an exterior that looks entirely undamaged, feathers smooth, no lacerations, no obvious sign of anything wrong, while the interior tells a completely different story. The difference between a bird that has been poisoned and a bird that has died from impact is, to a trained eye, not ambiguous. Poisoning, depending on the compound, typically leaves its marks in the organs most involved in processing and responding to chemical insults. The liver discolors, the kidneys show signs of failure, gastrointestinal tissue may be damaged or inflamed. Neurological lesions sometimes appear in birds exposed to organophosphates or other compounds that interfere with nerve signal transmission. In some poisoning cases, the pattern of organ involvement is specific enough that a pathologist can narrow the likely compound before toxicological screening has even returned results. The body's response to a toxic substance is systematic. It spreads through the tissues in ways that follow the pathways of metabolism and circulation, and the damage it leaves reflects that spread. Blunt trauma leaves a different signature entirely. The damage is local. It concentrates at the point of impact and radiates outward from there in ways that reflect the mechanics of the collision, the force, the angle, the hardness of the surface. In a small bird that has struck a rigid surface at speed, the pathologist will often find hemorrhage in the breast muscles, fractured bones where the impact was direct, and ruptured internal organs in the cavity behind the keel. The organs not in the path of the force may be entirely undamaged. The liver may be clean, the kidneys may be clean, the neurological tissue may show no sign of chemical insult at all. The bird died not because something moved through its body, but because something stopped it. These two pathological pictures, the systemic spread of chemical damage and the local concentration of impact injury, are different enough that a necropsy can often distinguish between them with reasonable confidence before any laboratory results arrive. The laboratory results, when they do come back, are what move the finding from probable to confirmed. Toxicological screening for pesticides, rodenticides, heavy metals, and common pathogens can return results within days to weeks of the event, depending on the volume of specimens and the specific compounds being tested. A clean screen, columns of negative results across every compound in the panel, does not simply indicate that the bird was not poisoned. It indicates, when read alongside the physical findings at necropsy, that the cause of death was almost certainly mechanical rather than chemical. The negative result and the positive finding of impact injury arrive together and point in the same direction. This pathological framework is not unique to birds. The same logic, systematic versus local damage, chemical versus mechanical cause, governs necropsy investigations in mammals, fish, and other wildlife. What varies is the specific anatomy and the specific compounds relevant to the species involved. A fish kill in a river system presents different pathological challenges than a bird mortality event in a city, and a mass die-off of marine mammals raises investigative questions that neither fish nor birds require. But the underlying logic of the inquiry is consistent. Establish what the body shows, match that against what different causes typically produce, and use laboratory screening to confirm or complicate what the physical findings suggest. The wildlife pathologists who do this work occupy a professional niche that rarely produces the kind of visibility that other areas of biological science can achieve, in part because most of what they investigate is local and resolvable and does not persist in public attention for very long. A mortality event is investigated, a cause is determined, a report is filed, and the event becomes a row in a database. The investigation itself, the specific intellectual work of examining a small animal under good light and reading what its tissues have to say, is, in most cases, known only to the people who conducted it and the agencies that commissioned it. The result is a kind of scientific labor that is unusually continuous and unusually quiet, producing a record that is detailed and reliable precisely because it is not contingent on any event being large enough or dramatic enough to attract resources. Research tracking how birds respond to fireworks has produced findings that, while not widely known, are specific enough to be instructive. Studies using weather radar and purpose-deployed bird tracking systems have documented what happens to roosting bird populations near active fireworks displays, and what they show is not subtle. When a display begins, bird activity in the surrounding airspace increases sharply, and immediately, birds that were settled, roosting, following the normal nocturnal pattern of a species that does not typically fly in darkness, become airborne in large numbers within seconds of the first detonations. The altitudes they reach are not normal roosting altitudes. Some birds ascend far above the landscape in the disorganized rapid climb of a flock, responding to perceived threat rather than navigating by choice. One study, published in a scientific journal, that tracks population ecology and organismal biology, used radar to observe bird populations near fireworks sites, and found that the bloom of movement visible on the radar display at the moment of ignition bore no resemblance to the organized, directional movement of birds in normal nocturnal migration. The shapes were wrong, the altitudes were wrong, the dispersal pattern spreading outward from the fireworks source in every direction, rather than following any flyway or heading, was consistent with a mass panic flush rather than any kind of purposeful movement. Some birds ascended thousands of feet. Others moved laterally at altitudes that brought them into the airspace occupied by buildings, utility lines, and other structures. The radar could document the movement, but not the individual fates. What it showed was the moment of disturbance and the wide, disordered scatter that followed it. The specific challenge for a nocturnal flock of startled birds is the combination of impaired vision and altered environment. A roosting site in bottomland marsh is a relatively open landscape at night. Reeds, open water, sky overhead, nothing rigid in most directions. The birds know it because they have been landing there every evening and leaving it every morning, and in daylight it presents no navigational difficulty. In darkness, without the cone-rich visual system that serves them so well in the light, it is a landscape of shapes and shadows, edges not clearly resolved, obstacles not reliably visible until they are very close. When the flock moves into an adjacent urban area, the streets and rooftops and utility infrastructure of a town that sits close to the roosting marsh, the environment changes in ways that compound the visual limitation. There are more surfaces, more angles, more things to strike. The birds moving through that space at speed, in darkness, with their navigational coherence broken by the panic of the initial flush, are navigating with the wrong equipment in the wrong landscape. The larger the roost, the more birds are exposed to this risk simultaneously. A roost of a few dozen birds startled in the dark produces a small disorganized flush that disperses quickly and in most cases without consequence. A roost of thousands of birds produces a different kind of event. The sheer number of individuals in the air at the same moment, in a compressed volume of airspace, with each bird responding to the movements of its nearest neighbors rather than to any coordinated group direction, means that the probability of collision with structures, with the ground, and with other birds scales with the size of the flock. The same impulse in the same landscape produces different outcomes depending entirely on the number of birds involved. A study published in 2012 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences took a different approach to the question of mass die-offs, not the mechanics of individual events, but the long-term pattern of how many events occurred and whether that pattern had changed over time. The researchers examined records of global mass die-off events across multiple animal groups, tracing the documented frequency of events from 1940 through the period leading up to publication. What they found when they graphed the data was a trend line that moved upward. The recorded frequency of mass die-off events increased across the decades covered by the study. The finding required immediate qualification, and the researchers were careful to provide it. The upward trend in recorded events did not necessarily reflect an upward trend in actual events. The reporting infrastructure for wildlife mortality, the agencies, the databases, the trained personnel, the professional norms around documentation had also expanded substantially over the same period. In 1940, a mass die-off in a remote wetland had very little chance of being formally recorded. There were fewer agencies looking, fewer personnel to conduct investigations, fewer systems in place to receive and store the information. By 2012, the infrastructure was denser, More people were watching more places with more systematic methods. The increase in recorded events likely reflected, at least in part, an increase in the capacity to detect and document events that were already occurring, a change in the observer rather than a change in the observed. The researchers flagged this carefully in their methods section, distinguishing between what the data showed and what it could be confidently interpreted to mean. This kind of caution is not a weakness of the study. It is one of its most useful features. A trend line that means what it appears to mean, and a trend line that means something different because of how the underlying data was collected, are not the same thing, and treating them as equivalent would produce conclusions the data does not support. The study was notable not only for the findings it reported, but for the rigorous care it took to describe what those findings could and could not be taken to imply. What the data did show, regardless of how the trend was interpreted, was the scale of the phenomenon at a global level. Mass die-offs are not rare. They are not exceptional events that appear a few times in a generation and then subside. They occur regularly across many species and many landscapes on every continent that supports animal life. Most of them are resolved locally, attributed to causes that are either well understood from previous cases or determinable through standard investigative methods, and then filed away without ever appearing in the news. They are, in the aggregate, a feature of the natural world rather than a departure from it. Part of what happens in a world where animals live at densities, in habitats, and under conditions that occasionally converge on mass mortality. The Whispers database entry for any given event is a kind of distillation of this ordinary scale. A researcher who calls up the full record, scrolling through hundreds of entries, each one representing a specific place on a specific date with a specific outcome, is looking at something that functions less like a catalog of disasters and more like a comprehensive account of the world's ongoing biological activity. The events range from the trivially small to the genuinely significant. They involve species that are abundant and species that are not. They occur in wilderness, in agricultural land, in suburban areas, and in the middle of large cities. They involve causes that range from the straightforward, a single well-understood pathogen, a documented toxic spill, a weather event of known character, to the genuinely ambiguous, where the investigation returned inconclusive findings, and the entry reflects that uncertainty rather than papering it over. The database does not resolve every event neatly. Some entries remain open or partially explained. An investigation that establishes what did not kill a group of animals has made real progress, but has not finished the work, and the record reflects both the progress and the remaining gap. This kind of partial resolution is not a failure of the system. It is what honest record-keeping looks like when applied to a world that does not always yield complete explanations on the investigator's preferred timeline. The gap in the record is information. It tells whoever comes to the data later that something happened, that it was investigated, and that the investigation reached a certain point and found what it found, including what it did not find. The study of mass mortality events in birds specifically has developed over time a vocabulary for distinguishing between different classes of cause. Infectious disease events have their own epidemiological signature. They spread through a population over time, with early cases and later cases, and the pathogen leaves evidence in the tissue that can be identified and cultured. Toxicological events are characterized by the pattern of organ involvement and confirmed by chemical screening. Trauma events show the concentrated mechanical damage of impact. Environmental events, cold snaps, ice storms, flooding, heat events, often show the physiological signs of stress combined with whatever specific damage the environmental condition produces. Starvation events show depleted fat reserves and reduced body mass. Each category has diagnostic characteristics, and the categories are not mutually exclusive. Some events involve more than one contributing cause, and the investigation must determine not just what was present, but what was primary. This taxonomic approach to cause of death in wildlife events reflects the same logic as clinical medicine, but applied to populations rather than individual patients. A clinician examining a single patient asks what combination of factors produce this outcome in this body. A wildlife pathologist examining the carcasses from a mass mortality event asks what combination of factors produce this outcome in this population at this time and place. The population framing adds complexity. The investigator must account for why this event happened to these animals here and now, and not to other members of the same species in other locations, but it also provides additional information. The specific geography and timing of a mortality event are themselves evidence. An event that occurs adjacent to a fireworks display on a national holiday, in a location where a large roost is known to have been established, is already partially explained by that context before any carcass has been examined. The building of investigative context, understanding what was happening in the landscape before the mortality event occurred, is part of the standard methodology for mass die-off investigation. Satellite data on land cover and habitat, historical records of roost locations and sizes, weather data from the hours leading up to the event, documented human activities in the area. All of it forms the evidentiary background against which the physical findings from the necropsy are read. A pathological finding that is consistent with multiple possible causes becomes significantly more specific when it is placed in an environmental context that rules out most of those causes and supports one of them. The finding and the context work together in a way that neither does alone. Were Luckströmsd. The National Wildlife Health Center in Madison has been building this kind of layered investigative record since its founding in 1975. The earliest entries in the system it eventually developed were, by current standards, relatively sparse. The data collection methods were less standardized, the tissue analysis techniques were less sensitive, and the network of reporting agencies was less extensive than what exists today. A researcher working in the mid-1970s, entering mortality event information into a filing system that would have looked entirely manual and entirely local, was nonetheless doing something that had genuine long-term significance. They were starting the record. They were establishing the beginning of the baseline that later investigators would need in order to know what ordinary looked like. The specific value of a long continuous record in this field comes from the fact that many of the most important questions about wildlife health are not questions about individual events, but about patterns, whether a particular cause of mortality is becoming more common or less, whether a pathogen is spreading geographically, whether a species is showing population-level effects from a chronic stressor that produces only small numbers of deaths in any given year. None of these questions can be answered from a single event or a single year of data. They require the kind of accumulated evidence that only comes from sustained, patient, consistent record-keeping over long periods. The fact that this work is unglamorous, that most years produce no major events, and most entries are unremarkable, is not a problem with the work. It is the point of it. The records also provide a baseline against which any individual event can be assessed. When a mortality event is reported, one of the first questions an investigator asks is whether this is unusual for this species in this location at this time of year. A species that experiences regular seasonal die-offs in a particular region has an expected baseline mortality pattern, and a deviation from that pattern is more informative than the absolute number of animals involved. 100 dead birds of a species that normally loses thousands in a given season is not necessarily a significant event. 100 dead birds of a species that rarely appears in regional mortality records at all may warrant more immediate attention. The significance of any event is relative to the baseline, and the baseline exists only because someone has been keeping the record. There is something quietly important in the image of that long record stretching backward through time, decades of accumulated entries, each one placed there by a person who went to a specific location, examined specific animals, and filed a specific report. The record is uneven. The coverage is better in some regions than others, better in some periods than others. It has gaps that reflect the limits of the reporting network at any given time, but it is also genuinely long enough that the pattern of ordinary annual variation in wildlife mortality is visible within it, long enough that a mass mortality event in any particular year can be read not as a shock against an empty background, but as one event against a detailed, specific, continuous account of what has been happening in the natural world, season by season, for the better part of half a century. Most of the events in that record were never reported in a newspaper. They were never described to a television camera. They were investigated by people whose professional obligation was to determine what happened and file an accurate report, and whose audience was a database and the agencies that would later query it. The birds in those entries fell in fields that no one was watching at the time, or in wetlands far enough from any road that the investigation required a specific effort to reach them, or in places where the only evidence was what the pathologist found at the necropsy table. Each one was a real event. Each one had a cause. Each one added, in its small way, to the accumulated account of what the world does when animals gather in large numbers and something in their environment changes in a way they cannot accommodate. Against that account, the long, quiet, continuous record of events across decades and species and landscapes, any single mortality event settles into a different kind of context than it would have without the record. It becomes legible as a specific instance of something that has been documented before, in different forms and different places, and will be documented again. The investigation that follows such an event is not starting from nothing. It is working within a framework built from every previous investigation, using methods refined by every previous case, and adding its findings to a record that will inform every future case. The work is cumulative. The record grows. The baseline becomes more accurate with every entry that is added to it. Every year, across North America and around the world, hundreds of mass mortality events are reported, investigated, classified, and filed. The vast majority of them are resolved without attracting any attention beyond the small professional community involved in the investigation. They are assigned causes, disease, exposure, trauma, starvation, collision, toxicity, and those causes are entered into databases that grow a little longer each year, a little more detailed, a little more capable of supporting the kind of pattern analysis that asks not what happened here, but what has been happening everywhere, steadily, in the background of the world that the rest of the world is not watching. The birds fall in their dozens and their thousands. The investigators arrive. The findings are recorded. The entries accumulate, row after quiet row, in the long archive of a world that has always been paying more attention than it appears. On a winter afternoon in northeastern Arkansas, A red-winged blackbird perches on a cattail stem at the edge of a flooded rice field. The light at this hour is low and pale, coming in at a long angle across the water, and the stem sways slightly under the bird's weight before settling still. The bird's plumage is a deep, unreflective black across the back and wings and head, the kind of black that absorbs the winter light rather than returning it. At the shoulder, just where the wing folds against the body, there is a patch of red so vivid it seems almost painted there, edged below with a narrow band of yellow that catches the afternoon in a way the rest of the bird does not. The bird holds itself on the cattail with the easy automatic grip of a creature that has been doing this its entire life, its small head turning once, twice, with the quick deliberate movements of an animal that makes its living by noticing things. That eye is worth a moment's attention. It is bright and dark and entirely alert, and it is built for days like this one, for pale winter light skimming a flat landscape, for the particular visual problem of distinguishing a seed from a stone on the surface of a harvested field. Red-winged blackbirds are daytime animals in a way that goes deeper than habit. Their eyes contain a relatively high density of the photoreceptor cells, responsible for color perception and fine detail in good light, and a lower density of the cells that manage low light sensitivity. This arrangement gives them something close to excellent color vision across the spectrum visible to most birds, which extends into the ultraviolet range and gives them access to color information entirely outside what a human observer would see from the same field margin. The bird on the cattail is, in visual terms, a richly equipped creature in the right conditions. What those conditions require is light. What that limitation means in a dark urban landscape on a cold night is something else. The flooded rice field stretching away behind the bird is a reliable place to be in winter if a bird is a red-winged blackbird in northeastern Arkansas. The region lies across the broad corridor of the Mississippi Flyway, one of the four main pathways along which North American birds move between their northern breeding grounds and their southern wintering areas, and northeastern Arkansas occupies a particular position within that corridor. The landscape here is shaped by the Mississippi and its tributaries, the rivers cutting through lowland bottomland forests, the oxbow lakes left behind when old channels shifted, the flooded fields of the rice-growing agricultural districts, the marsh edges and brushy thicket lines where standing water meets raised ground. For a bird that feeds on seeds and insects and requires dense vegetation for roosting cover, it is an unusually well-supplied landscape, even in the months when everything north of here is locked under snow. Red-winged blackbirds do not form small, discrete groups in winter. They gather in numbers that require a different way of thinking about scale. A winter roost in the agricultural bottomlands of the Mid-South can hold tens of thousands of birds, or hundreds of thousands, or at the largest documented sites, numbers that approach 1 million individuals, all settling into the same stand of marsh reeds or brushy lowland scrub as the light fades each afternoon. These are not loose aggregations. The birds arrive from the surrounding landscape in continuous streams, following the same approach lines day after day, the flock building in density and volume as the hour advances toward dark. They arrive from fields and wood edges and road margins across a radius of many miles, and the roost consolidates from all those directions at once. The streams of birds merging and layering until the reeds and cattails and willow thickets are so dense with wings and bodies that the vegetation itself seems to have become animate. The benefits of this gathering are not difficult to understand in outline. A bird roosting in a group of 1,000 is a bird whose individual probability of predator detection at any given moment is offset by the collective vigilance of 999 other pairs of eyes. When one bird notices a threat and launches, the mass of birds around it responds within fractions of a second, the whole flock lifting and contracting and expanding in the fluid, coordinated way that has been observed in blackbird roosts and starling murmurations and shorebird flocks across the world. There is also the matter of warmth. In a dense winter roost, the collective heat of hundreds of thousands of small warm bodies packed into a stand of marsh vegetation raises the local temperature measurably, reducing the energetic cost each individual bird pays just to maintain its body temperature through a cold night. A bird that saves energy on warmth has more energy for the morning's foraging. These are the straightforward arithmetic advantages of numbers, and red-winged blackbirds have been solving this particular arithmetic problem across generations far longer than the fields they roost near have been rice paddies. The flocks in these winter gatherings are not made up entirely of red-winged blackbirds. The communal winter roosts of the mid-south and southeastern states draw in several species simultaneously, and on any given night, a large roost site might contain European starlings, common grackles, brown-headed cowbirds, and rusty blackbirds alongside the redwings, each species finding in the same location the same basic combination of dense cover and shared vigilance. The proportions shift across the season and across different parts of the landscape, but the mixed assemblage is the norm rather than the exception, and the birds appear largely indifferent to the species distinctions that a human observer would find obvious. What matters to a bird choosing a roost site is not the species composition of its neighbors, but whether the location has enough cover, enough approach routes, and enough previous evidence of safety to justify returning night after night. The individual bird on the cattail this afternoon weighs somewhere between 32 and 77 grams, depending on its age, its sex, its current nutritional state, and where in the season's cycle it currently sits. That is a range roughly equivalent to the weight of a small handful of coins, a very small handful at the lower end. The body that weighs so little is organized around the central problem of flight in a way that touches every part of its anatomy. The bones are hollow, their walls thin, their interiors laced with air spaces connected to the bird's respiratory system, rather than filled with the marrow that gives mammal bones their weight. This pneumatization, as it is called, runs through much of the skeleton, reducing mass without sacrificing structural integrity in the ways that matter most during the controlled, repeated stresses of powered flight. A bird's bones are not fragile in the ordinary sense. They are engineered for specific loads, and under those loads they perform with precision. What they are not engineered for is impact with a hard surface at speed, which produces exactly the kind of force they have no structural answer to. Running along the underside of the body, from the base of the neck toward the tail, is the keel, a projecting ridge of the sternum that serves as the anchor point for the powerful muscles that drive the downstroke of the wings. In a healthy, well-fed red-winged blackbird, these flight muscles are substantial relative to total body mass, and their operation on the downstroke is where most of the energy of flight is concentrated. The keel bone that anchors them is relatively thin, and the muscle tissue it supports, for all its power in the context of flight, is soft and poorly buffered against the kind of abrupt, external compression that a high-velocity collision with a hard surface would produce. The bird on the cattail is, in this precise mechanical sense, a creature whose architecture is oriented entirely toward one direction of force and has no meaningful armoring against another. None of this is a vulnerability in any ordinary sense of the word. A red-winged blackbird living through a winter in northeastern Arkansas, following the daily rhythm of roost to foraging field and back again, does not encounter the situation in which that architectural limitation becomes relevant. The birds at a winter roost are dealing with cold and with the energetic demands of staying warm and fed, and with the occasional predator, a Cooper's hawk stooping into the flock edge, a great horned owl working the roost margins at dusk. These are the pressures that have shaped everything about how the bird lives and moves and gathers with its kind. The hollow bones and the thin keel and the small total mass are solutions to a different problem, and for the vast majority of nights in a winter bottomland, they are perfectly adequate solutions. It is worth dwelling on what the bird's world looks like on an ordinary night when it has returned to the roost and settled into the reeds with thousands of its neighbors. The bird is not, in any meaningful sense, awake and processing its environment the way it will be in the morning. Its metabolic rate has dropped, its core temperature has settled into the lower range of its thermoregulatory capacity. The eyes that were so alert this afternoon are now oriented toward nothing in particular, and what ambient light exists in the roost site at midnight in a rural bottomland, the reflected glow of a distant town, the weak light of a winter moon through overcast, is light that the bird's eye is not well placed to use productively. The bird has, in this set of circumstances, effectively traded visual acuity for the metabolic benefits of a diminished arousal state. What it gains in energy conservation, it temporarily gives up in its capacity to orient itself in a landscape of obstacles. The collective flight behavior of these large winter flocks has been observed and described in enough detail that certain patterns emerge clearly. When a roost is disturbed by a sudden stimulus, a loud noise, a bright light, a predator making contact with the edge of the flock, the birds closest to the disturbance launch first, and the birds surrounding them launch in response to those birds launching, each individual reacting to the movement of its nearest neighbors, rather than to any shared understanding of the threat or any centralized instruction from a leader. There is no leader. The flock has no center from which instructions flow. What it has instead is a set of individual response rules that, in the right conditions and at the right scale, produce remarkably fluid, coordinated-looking movement, the rolling, shape-shifting quality that makes a large blackbird flock in flight one of the more striking things available to observe in a winter landscape. Those same response rules, in different conditions, produce something else when the disturbance is large enough, sudden enough, and distributed enough through the roost that the normal sequence of neighbor-following responses becomes overloaded. The result is not coordinated movement, but a mass flush, thousands of birds airborne within seconds, each one responding to the immediate birds around it, rather than to the landscape it is entering. The flock does not know where it is going. It does not have a destination or a direction. What it has is momentum and the rapidly accumulating problem of a great many small, disoriented, visually limited birds sharing a volume of dark air with utility poles, rooftops, road surfaces, and the sides of buildings. Researchers tracking bird movements near fireworks displays using weather radar have observed the kind of activity this produces. Sudden dense blooms of movement at and above rooftop altitude, birds ascending in directions with no navigational coherence, the flock spreading outward from the disturbance site in patterns that bear no resemblance to the purposeful, organized movements of normal nocturnal migration. The red-winged blackbird on the cattail this afternoon has no particular relationship with any of this. It is eating and watching and sitting in the low winter light, doing the things it does on an ordinary winter afternoon. The field behind it stretches away flat and pale, The surface of the standing water, still in the absence of wind, reflecting back the same featureless gray sky it sits under. There are other birds visible across the field, other blackbirds, a few grackles working the shallower margins, a small group of starlings moving low over the stubble in the middle distance. The afternoon is doing what winter afternoons do here, settling gradually toward the early dark, the light losing its flatness and acquiring the brief angled warmth it sometimes finds just before it goes. A male red-winged blackbird in breeding condition, in the spring and summer months, is one of the more conspicuous birds in the North American landscape. The combination of the jet black body and the vivid epaulet patch, that red and yellow shoulder, is a signal that carries real function during the season, when males are establishing territories in marsh habitat and competing for positions that determine their breeding success. The red shoulder patches can be partly concealed when the bird wants to reduce its visibility, and partly displayed when it wants to assert presence, and the degree of display carries information about status and willingness to contest territory that other males appear to read with some accuracy. This is a bird with a relatively complex seasonal social life, oriented around the specific geography of wetland edges and the particular competitive pressures of a species where a small number of high-quality territory holders do a disproportionate amount of the breeding. In winter, the social architecture simplifies. The territorial displays cease. The striking epaulets are still present on adult males, but they are not being used as competitive signals in the same way. The birds are in a different mode, shaped by different requirements, moving through a different kind of day. What persists across both seasons is the basic sensory orientation toward light, toward the visual information that the daytime landscape provides, and that the bird's eye is built to receive and process. A red-winged blackbird's day, regardless of the season, begins with light and ends before the absence of it becomes a serious problem for navigation. The Mississippi Flyway, as a geographic fact, is less a single corridor than a broad zone of habitats concentrated along the drainage basin of the Mississippi River and its major tributaries. It is one of the most heavily used bird migration routes in North America, carrying an enormous proportion of the waterfowl, shorebirds, raptors, and passerine songbirds that winter in the Gulf Coast states and return north to breed across the continent's interior. In November and December, the movement through this corridor is not a trickle, but a sustained, broad front passage of millions of birds across the width of the central continent. Radar imagery from this period shows the night sky over the Mississippi drainage lit with biological movement, the collective echo of wings against the beam, building in intensity as the evening progresses and fading as dawn approaches, night after night, across the weeks of peak passage. Northeastern Arkansas sits in the middle of this corridor, and its landscape of flooded agricultural fields, bottomland hardwood forests, and wetland margins has made it one of the more productive wintering areas within the flyway for granivorous birds, birds that eat seeds. The rice fields in particular provide a resource base that can support large concentrations of wintering blackbirds across the months when the northern breeding grounds are unavailable. A bird that made the journey south along the flyway and found its way to this landscape in October or November would find food reliable, cover adequate, and the social conditions for large roost formation already present. It would settle in for the winter and follow the daily rhythm of the roost site with the same consistency that characterizes most aspects of a small bird's short-term behavior. What the bird's life looks like from inside this routine is not something that ornithology can speak to directly. What the bird does is carefully documented: the roost to foraging field movement in the morning, the gradual return movement in the afternoon, the specific landscape features that seem to matter to roost site selection, the alarm responses, the foraging techniques, the social interactions at the margins of the flock. What the bird experiences, in any richer sense, is genuinely beyond the current capacity of behavioral science to determine, and the honest approach is simply to leave that question open without pretending to an answer. The bird on the cattail is doing what it does. It is doing it well. The afternoon is progressing around it in the ordinary way that winter afternoons in northeastern Arkansas progress. A red-winged blackbird's voice is one of the sounds most reliably associated with North American wetlands in spring and summer. The male's song, a liquid, slightly mechanical conclary that carries across open water with surprising clarity. In winter, the birds are less vocal, but not silent. The roost sites at dusk carry a continuous overlapping noise of chips and calls from hundreds or thousands of birds, a collective sound that rises and falls with the movement of the flock and can be heard from a considerable distance before the roost itself becomes visible. It is the kind of sound that marks a place on a winter landscape with the same reliability as a landmark, audible before the dark shapes of the birds become distinguishable from the dark shapes of the vegetation they are settling into. The birds have been in this part of Arkansas for several months by the time the winter is well advanced. They arrived in autumn with the other migratory species, part of the broad southward movement that empties the northern marshes and fields as the season closes in, and they will remain through the coldest months before the same internal calendar that brought them south begins to pull them north again in late winter and early spring. This movement is not random. The birds return to the same general areas and sometimes the same specific roost sites year after year. They are not lost here, and they are not displaced here. They are in precisely the place that generations of learning and biological pressure have made the right place for them to be in January. The flooded rice fields and the bottomland reeds and the wide, flat agricultural landscape of northeastern Arkansas are, for these birds, the winter world. The body mass range of 32 to 77 grams spans a significant variation, and most of that variation comes down to sex and nutritional condition rather than individual size differences. Adult males tend toward the higher end of the range, females and juveniles toward the lower end. A bird in good condition, having fed well through the autumn and maintained body reserves into winter, will sit at the heavier end of its natural range. A bird that has had a difficult winter, cold, food scarce, requiring the expenditure of stored fat just to maintain body temperature through successive cold nights, will sit lighter. The difference matters because a heavier bird has more reserve for the metabolic demands that any disruption to normal routine will impose. But in terms of the fundamental physics of a small, hollow-boned animal striking a hard surface at speed, neither a 32-gram bird nor a 77-gram bird has an answer that biology has provided for. The flight muscles that attach to the keel represent the single largest muscle group in the bird's body. In a bird that is using them actively, these muscles generate the force for powered, sustained flight, and are among the most metabolically active tissues in any animal, consuming oxygen at rates that require the bird's respiratory system to refresh its blood gases with each wing cycle, rather than in the separate inhale-exhale rhythm of a mammal's breathing. A bird in sustained flight is a machine operating at something close to its physiological limit, exchanging air through a respiratory system that works continuously in one direction, absorbing oxygen and expelling carbon dioxide without the pause that a mammal's breathing requires. The result is a remarkably efficient system for sustaining the energy expenditure that flight demands. It is also, in the specific context of a high-velocity collision with a stationary surface, The system whose primary organ, that large, soft, relatively unprotected muscle mass anchored to the thin keel, bears the first and most concentrated force of impact. The winter light is going now, the brief angled warmth in the last hour of afternoon, fading back into the flat gray that preceded it. The bird on the cattail has shifted its posture slightly, the way birds do when they are preparing to move, a small alerting in the body, a redistribution of weight, a change in how the head is held. Across the field, and along the tree line, and from directions invisible from this vantage point, other birds are beginning the same gradual reorientation. The afternoon foraging is drawing to its close, not because anything announces that it is over, but because the light is going, and the body knows the light is going, and the body has a place to be when the light is gone. The communal roost in the bottomlands a few miles to the south is already receiving early arrivals, birds that left their foraging areas before most of the others, following the shallowest end of the light gradient, the ones that had found what they needed early and were moving first. The reeds and willow scrub at the roost site have held birds every night for months, and the smell and sound and physical memory of the place, encoded in whatever way small birds encode the memory of places, is pulling the birds toward it as reliably as a current pulls a leaf toward a drainage point. They come in from all compass directions. They follow the edges of fields and the lines of tree rows and the open corridors above waterways, the landscape serving as a navigation aid in the last minutes of adequate light. From above, if a person could see it, and radar operators tracking large bird concentrations in this part of the flyway sometimes can, the movement toward the roost would look like the slow convergence of many thin streams toward a single point, the streams thickening as they approach the site, the density of birds increasing across the last mile, as individuals who had been moving along parallel tracks were funneled by the landscape geometry into the same narrow approach corridor. Closer to the roost, the streams merge into a single dense flow, and the sound that had been a distant, undifferentiated noise across the fields becomes a specific, complex, layered sound. The individual voices of thousands of birds stacked on each other until the air above the reeds is as much sound as it is silence. The actual settling into the roost is not orderly in any simple sense, but it is not chaotic either. Birds enter the vegetation from above, dropping into the upper layers of the reeds, and others follow, the layers filling from the outside in as latecomers find positions within the available space. The early arrivals in the best positions, deeper in the vegetation, more sheltered from wind, pressed against the warmth of other birds on multiple sides, will have the lowest overnight metabolic demands. The later arrivals at the exposed edges will spend more energy staying warm and will need to find more food tomorrow morning to compensate. These are the small, continuous, invisible competitions that determine whether a given bird will still be present in the roost in April when the movement north begins, or whether it will have been reduced to a deficit it could not recover from. The roost in full occupation, as the last light goes and the birds stop arriving, is dense enough that from a distance it looks less like a concentration of individual animals and more like a change in the texture of the vegetation, the reeds seeming to move differently, to hold more weight, to make more sound than bare stems would in the same wind. The sky above the site has cleared to the kind of deep, cold winter dark that accumulates over flat agricultural land when there is no significant source of light pollution nearby to bounce light off the overcast. The birds in the reeds are warm relative to the air, metabolically quiet, crowded into a physical density that is its own form of protection. From outside the roost, standing on the frost-firm ground at the field margin, A person would hear the flock before seeing anything, a soft, continuous, collective sound of thousands of small bodies, breathing and shifting, and occasionally calling out in some private communication between neighbors. The sound so consistent and unbroken it becomes something close to silence itself. The catalogee stem at the edge of the flooded rice field is bare now. The bird that was there has joined the general movement toward the roost, following the approach corridor south along the field margin, and then cutting across the open water where the flooded field gives way to the managed marsh that borders the bottomland, dropping into the reeds with the precision of a creature that has done this specific landing many times in many conditions. It's settled somewhere in the middle layers of the vegetation, pressed against other birds on three sides, its feet locked automatically around a stem, its eyes closed to the dark that it was never built for. Around it, in every direction, within a radius measured in hundreds of yards, rather than inches, thousands of other birds are doing the same thing, metabolically quiet, collectively warm, the individual animals subsumed for the duration of the night into something that functions as a single large organism, optimized for surviving until morning. The stream of birds arriving at the roost has been flowing for 30 minutes or more by the time the last of the light is fully gone. For the half hour before that, the line between the day world and the night world was gradual, the light stepping down through a series of thresholds, the birds' movements shifting from the wide dispersal of afternoon foraging to the convergent flow of the approach, the landscape compressing toward a single point as the dark gathered. The arrival itself, the moment when a given bird drops from the approach corridor into the vegetation for the final time and settles, is quiet. There is no announcement. The wings fold, the feet grip, the body finds its position among the bodies already present, and the bird that was one moment a moving thing against the fading sky becomes the next simply part of the dense, warm, quietly breathing mass of the roost. This has been happening in this bottomland, or in bottomlands very much like it, for a very long time. The flooded rice fields are recent by any historical standard, replacing the native bottomland vegetation that preceded agriculture in this part of the continent. But the bird's relationship with this general type of landscape, with flat, wet, seed-productive lowland, close to dense marsh vegetation that can serve as shelter, runs back much further than the rice industry, further than the settlement of the region, further than any human activity in this part of North America. The birds are here because this is the kind of place that the winter version of their life has always required, and the kind of place has remained available here across all the changes that have rearranged the surface of the land around it. The last birds arriving at the roost come in low and fast, cutting across the top of the standing vegetation and dropping in with less ceremony than the earlier arrivals. The roost site has been receiving birds for so long this evening that the available positions near the interior are full, and the latecomers settle at the edges and upper layers where the wind gets through and the cover is thinner. They fold their wings and lock their feet and are still. The sound of the flock, which peaked during the period of heaviest arrival and has been dropping in volume since, settles now into the low, continuous undertone that it will hold for the rest of the night. Thousands of birds, warm and still and close together, the reeds around them holding the collective heat of all those small bodies, the winter dark uninterrupted above. The red-winged blackbird is by most measures of abundance one of the most successful birds in North America. Its total population runs into the hundreds of millions. It occupies wetland habitat from coast to coast, from the northern breeding grounds across Canada to the wintering areas of the Mid-South and Gulf states, and its adaptability to agricultural landscapes has probably allowed it to expand its winter range considerably over the past century as rice and grain cultivation created new habitat that functions from a wintering blackbird's point of view, much like the native marshland it replaced. A species that numerous, that widely distributed, that effectively integrated into such a variety of landscapes, is not a species in any precarious position. It is a species in the full expression of its particular way of being in the world, common in the way that only a handful of creatures manage to be common, present in numbers that make individual encounters with it a daily, unremarkable event for anyone living in its range. The bird on the stem this afternoon, the one that caught the winter light on its red shoulder patch, the one whose alert eye turned twice in the still air, is one of those individuals in that uncountable general population. It is not rare. It is not remarkable as an individual. What it is,
looked at closely in the specific facts of its body and its senses and its habits, is genuinely interesting. A creature whose architecture tells a clear story about the pressures that shaped it, whose daily life enacts the solutions its ancestors arrived at over time, whose presence in the winter bottomlands of northeastern Arkansas is the current expression of a long and uninterrupted relationship between this kind of animal and this kind of place.
the roost in the Arkansas bottomlands holds the birds through the dark hours of the winter night, the vegetation bending slightly under their weight, the collective warmth of the flock holding against the cold coming off the open water. A great horned owl works the field margin to the east, following its own separate arithmetic of predator and prey. But the roost site itself is too dense for that kind of hunting. The birds in the interior are beyond reach, and the birds at the edge are alert enough, even in their overnight quietness, to launch at any pressure that comes too close. By first light, the movement will reverse, the flock lifting from the reeds in the gradual, unhurried dispersal of a morning that is not yet fully decided, spreading back out across the surrounding landscape in the same streams that converged here the previous evening, the individual birds flowing away in every direction across the pale winter fields toward the business of another day, the roost site emptying as smoothly and continuously as it filled until the reeds are bare again and still, and the morning is simply a winter morning in a bottomland, waiting for evening. On the morning of January 5th, 2011, the residents of Falkaping woke to something they had not expected to find on their street. Falkaping is a quiet Swedish town, the kind of place where a winter morning arrives gray and cold and largely uneventful, where frost settles on cobblestones that have been there for centuries, and the early risers are mostly people walking to work before the sky has properly decided to be light. What they found on the stones that morning were birds, 50 of them, perhaps 100. The counts varied slightly between reports. Small dark jackdaws lying along a stretch of street in the town center, their wings folded, their positions on the cobbles suggesting they had simply come down from somewhere above and stopped. Some residents noticed them before they understood what they were looking at. At that hour, in that light, the shapes on the stones were just shapes. Then someone bent down or looked more closely, and the shapes became birds, and the morning became something worth remembering. Swedish wildlife authorities arrived and examined the carcasses. The investigation that followed was brief and largely consistent with conclusions reached just days earlier and an ocean away. The jackdaws had been roosting somewhere near the town center. Something had disturbed them. Fireworks from the New Year's celebration still recent enough to be plausible, or possibly a vehicle moving through their roost site at an hour when the birds were settled and slow to respond, and the flock had flushed into the dark. The darkness, the structures of a town built across centuries of stone and timber and concrete, the disorientation of a roost disturbed without warning at night. These were not a combination the birds had any preparation for. They came down on the cobblestones. The investigation closed on blunt trauma, the same finding that had been documented in Arkansas, and the morning in Falkaping was filed and moved on from, as most mornings are. What made the Falkaping case interesting was not that it was unusual, it was that it happened so close in time to the Arkansas event that journalists who had already written about Beebe found themselves writing about Sweden before their first stories had finished circulating. The proximity in the calendar, 4 days, nothing more, produced the impression of a connection. The same questions that had been asked about Beebe were asked again about Falkaping, with a slightly more urgent tone. Wildlife officials in Sweden noted, patiently, that jackdaws are common roosting birds in European town centers, that fireworks are ignited in those town centers at the end of every year, and that the collision of those two facts had probably produced quiet, local, unannounced mortality events in European cities, many times before the winter of 2011. The difference in January 2011 was that people were already looking. The Senio River runs through the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy, passing through the town of Faenza on its way south toward the Adriatic. In early January of 2011, investigators working along its banks in the reed beds and gravel margins of the river documented thousands of turtle doves lying dead among the winter vegetation. Turtle doves are pale, soft-colored birds, smaller than a city pigeon, with a delicate rose flush at the breast and dark scaled patterning on the wings, and they had come to winter along the river in numbers large enough that their loss was visible and unmistakable. Some of the carcasses showed a faint blue-green discoloration at the tip of the beak, a detail that circulated quickly through Italian news outlets, and that investigators moved to explain before the speculation could run far. The discoloration, it turned out, was consistent with an indigestive or mild toxic process, possibly related to the birds having eaten sunflower seeds or other food in quantities that stress their digestive systems during a period of cold. The investigation into the Faenza die-off drew more criticism from wildlife scientists than the Beebe or Falkaping cases did, because it arrived at not one conclusion, but a cluster of contributing factors: stress from fireworks, possible overfeeding prior to death, and the unconfirmed possibility of a mild viral infection operating in a flock already weakened by the cold. Some researchers felt the investigation had stopped short of the single definitive explanation they would have preferred to see. Others noted that mass die-off events rarely owe themselves to one cause cleanly, that bird populations experiencing stress from one direction are more vulnerable to a second, and that the Faenza findings, however imprecise in their combination, were not in any way consistent with a novel or alarming source. The river in January returned to its ordinary appearance within days. The reed beds continued as reed beds do. What the Faenza case contributed to the record was a demonstration of how investigations of this kind proceed under pressure. When a large number of animals die at once in a visible way, in a landscape that people use and know, the public expectation tends to be a single cause delivered cleanly and quickly. Wildlife pathology does not always work on that schedule. The truth of what happened along the Senio River was probably a set of interlocking conditions rather than one agent, and the researchers who said so were not equivocating. They were describing, with some precision, the way that populations under accumulated stress respond differently to the same environmental pressures than populations that are well nourished and undisturbed. That the Faenza investigation left some scientists unsatisfied was not a failure of the science. It was an accurate reflection of how multiple small pressures can combine to produce a single visible outcome, and how difficult it can be to separate those pressures after the fact when the birds are already on the riverbank. The Louisiana coast in January of 2011 was still recovering in its own gradual way from the months of the preceding year, and the brown pelicans found along a stretch of that coastline in the same week as the Beebe and Falkaping events arrived in the news, at a moment when readers were already primed for unusual animal mortality. Brown pelicans are large, old-looking birds, heavy-beaked, prehistoric in their proportions, capable of plunging from height into water with a precision that looks more like controlled accident than skill. They are not fragile animals in the ordinary course of things. They are adapted to the rough conditions of coastal life. The wind, the salt, the turbulent surface of the Gulf, but the winter storm system that moved through the Gulf Coast in that period was not ordinary weather, and the pelicans that investigators examined on the beach told a story that was legible in their bodies. The carcasses showed evidence of blunt trauma, the same category of finding that had appeared in the Arkansas necropsy reports and the Swedish investigation, but in combination with poor body condition, consistent with extended exposure to cold and wet without adequate food. The storm had done what large storm systems do to birds operating near the edge of their normal energy reserves. It had pushed them into situations they could not recover from. Rough water, disorientation in high winds, the failure to find the thermal updrafts and sheltered feeding areas they would normally have used. These were the conditions, and the combination had been enough. Wildlife officials classified the deaths as a weather-related mass mortality event. The pelicans, like the blackbirds in Arkansas and the jackdaws in Sweden, had encountered the world in a configuration that left them no margin. The difference was the mechanism, not the fundamental category. Brown pelicans in Louisiana had been on the recovery end of a long conservation effort, their populations having been severely reduced in the mid-20th century by the effects of agricultural pesticides on their egg viability, and brought back through a decades-long combination of protection and habitat work. The sight of dead pelicans on a Louisiana beach in January 2011 carried for some wildlife managers and conservationists working in that region a particular weight, not because the storm deaths erased the recovery. The population was large enough by that point that a single event of this scale did not threaten it, but because pelicans had required so much sustained effort to return to the Louisiana coast, that seeing them on the sand in any condition other than alive and fishing was a specific kind of difficult. The birds on the beach in January were not evidence that the recovery had failed. They were evidence that recovered populations, like all populations, continue to inhabit a world where storms occur. Away from the Gulf and the winter coast, in the tidal marshes and rivers of the mid-Atlantic, a smaller and quieter die-off pattern had been documented by wildlife officials in the winter of 2012, involving a bird that most people rarely notice, the pied-billed grebe. Pied-billed grebes are compact, brown, almost necklace diving birds that spend their winters on open water, ponds, lakes, slow rivers, coastal bays, where they feed by diving from the surface and pursuing small fish and invertebrates underwater with their lobed feet. They are not built for land. Their feet, positioned far back on the body for efficient underwater propulsion, make walking on solid ground awkward, and their wing anatomy requires a long-running takeoff across open water to generate the speed needed for flight. A pied-billed grebe that lands on something that is not water cannot take off from it. This is not usually a problem. Pied-billed grebes have been landing on water for a very long time, and the system generally works. The problem in the winter of 2012 was that a pied-billed grebe navigating at night or in fog or in the particular low-light conditions of a wet winter day, cannot always distinguish between the reflective surface of a pond and the reflective surface of a wet road or a parking lot. To a bird, reading the world primarily through the way surfaces catch light, a large flat expanse of wet asphalt in the dark can appear functionally identical to the surface of water. Grebes were found stranded across the Chesapeake Bay region on roads and in parking lots, unable to take off, waiting in a kind of composed helplessness for something to change. Some of them died of exposure before they were found. Others were struck by vehicles. Wildlife officials and bird rehabilitation centers in the region collected and released those that were rescued in time, returning them to water surfaces from which they simply paddled away, resuming the life they had been temporarily detached from. The cause, wet road grounding, the technical term is sometimes given as grounding mortality, was already a documented phenomenon in bird mortality literature before 2012. The Grebes had not done anything unprecedented. They had encountered a feature of a human-altered landscape that their visual system, refined over millions of years to read the natural world, had no way to distinguish from the real thing. What the Grebes situation illustrates, quietly and without requiring any particular alarm, is the way that landscape changes accumulate into friction for birds that evolved before those changes existed. The grebe is not a fragile or poorly adapted animal. It is extremely well adapted to a world that contains large flat reflective water surfaces and very few large flat reflective non-water surfaces. The expansion of roads, parking structures, and other large paved areas across the landscape has introduced a category of object that the grebe's sensory system cannot reliably separate from the habitat it needs. This is not a crisis. Grebes remain widespread and abundant. It is simply a place where the ancient and the recent do not quite align, and where the cost of that misalignment is paid by individual birds landing on parking lots in Maryland in December, sitting very still and waiting. The records of bird mortality go back further than most people expect them to. The scientific study of birds as a population-level subject, rather than simply as objects of collection or curiosity, developed through the 19th and into the early 20th century, and with it came the practice of documenting unusual mortality events with enough precision that the records could be used by later researchers trying to understand the historical baseline. One of the earlier mass mortality events recorded in the scientific literature with sufficient detail to be cited by 20th century ornithologists reviewing the long record of the phenomenon involved the winter of 1904, a region of southern New Jersey, and birds that most people would walk past without noticing: song sparrows and white-throated sparrows, small streaked birds of fields and hedgerows, the kind that spend their winters picking seeds from the ground in the stubble of harvested fields. In the winter of 1904, a severe ice storm moved through the region. Ice storms of this kind, the specific meteorological event in which rain falls through a layer of cold air near the ground and freezes on contact with surfaces, have a particular and comprehensive effect on a winter landscape. The storm doesn't cover things with snow, which at least has a texture and a permeability that birds can sometimes work through or beneath. An ice storm coats everything, every stem, every dried seed head, every patch of open ground, every sheltering shrub, in a clear, seamless shell of ice that catches whatever light exists and turns the landscape into something beautiful and entirely unavailable. For birds that depend on ground-level seeds as their primary winter food source, a landscape sealed under ice is a landscape from which all nutrition has been removed. The seeds are there, inches below the surface that the bird is standing on, and they might as well not exist. The sparrows in the New Jersey fields in 1904 were found in the days following the storm, scattered across the frozen ground in the stubble of fields that had been active feeding sites before the ice came. Song sparrows are small birds, weighing between 12 and 28 grams, and their ability to maintain body temperature through a cold night depends entirely on the fuel they can accumulate during the day. A song sparrow that cannot feed through a day of ice-locked landscape arrives at the following night with insufficient reserves to maintain its body temperature until morning. The ice storm lasted several days. The mortality was documented by ornithologists working in the region, who preserved enough detail in their accounts, species, location, approximate numbers, weather conditions, that the event remained citable in the literature for decades. It stands in the long record of bird mortality events as one of the points from which the modern study of mass die-off frequency traces its history. What the 1904 records capture in their careful way is something that wildlife scientists, returning to them a century later, found both useful and humbling. The event was not exceptional in the sense of being unprecedented. Ice storms happen, birds die in ice storms. The fact that this particular event was recorded with enough precision to be useful as a data point was itself something of an accident of circumstance. The right ornithologists, in the right region, with the habits of documentation that the scientific culture of that era was just beginning to establish as standard practice. The records that were not made, the events that happened in the preceding centuries before anyone was reliably writing them down, are gaps in the archive rather than absences from the world. The birds fell. They simply fell without anyone keeping the count. There is something worth sitting with in that. The sparrows in the New Jersey fields in 1904 were part of a pattern that had been occurring every time a severe ice storm moved through a landscape where small birds were wintering, for as long as both ice storms and small birds had coexisted in that region, which is to say, for a very long time. The ornithologists who documented the 1904 event were not witnessing the beginning of a problem. They were, for one of the first times, noticing and recording a thing that had always happened. The record starts where observation starts. What was there before the observation is an open space, not an empty one. The cases from 2011 and 2012, Arkansas, Sweden, Italy, Louisiana, Maryland, arrived in the news during a period when the public infrastructure for sharing and amplifying unusual events had expanded considerably from anything available in 1904. A wildlife mortality event that would formerly have been noted in a regional newspaper and archived in a state agency's filing system was now capable, given the right conditions, of circulating across multiple continents within hours. The clustering of visible events in that short period was partly a function of timing and partly a function of the season, New Year's fireworks, winter storms, the particular vulnerabilities of winter roosting birds, and partly a function of the fact that once the Beebe event had been widely reported, journalists and members of the public began noticing and reporting events that they might otherwise have mentioned only to their neighbors. This is not a cynical observation. The increased attention was in many ways genuinely useful. Wildlife monitoring agencies reported that public reporting of mortality events increased in the months following the Beebe coverage, which is precisely how the detection and recording infrastructure improves over time. People who had found dead birds in fields or on roads in previous winters and done nothing with the observation because they had no obvious place to report, it began to understand that there were agencies interested in exactly that kind of information. The Whispers database in Madison, Wisconsin, which maintains a continuous record of wildlife mortality events reported from across the country, received more public submissions in the months after January 2011 than in comparable periods before it. The events were not new. The reporting was new. Each case from that winter had its own specific cause, its own investigative trail, its own set of findings that resolved into a known category of wildlife mortality. When the necropsy results came back and the weather data was examined and the historical records were consulted, the jackdaws in Falkoping had their cobblestone street and their fireworks and their darkfang. The turtle doves along the Senio had their riverbank and their cold and their accumulated stress. The pelicans on the Louisiana coast had their storm and their rough water and their long recovery from a chemical history that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with why their deaths, specifically, landed with a particular weight for the people watching. The Grapes in Maryland had their parking lots and their ancient sensory systems reading the world as it had been rather than as it had become. The sparrows in 1904 had their ice-sealed fields, and the long pre-dawn cold of a January night in southern New Jersey with insufficient fuel to make it through. None of these cases required one another to be true. None of them implied a connected mechanism operating across the globe. What they shared was a category, mass die-off event, blunt trauma, weather stress, habitat mismatch, the accumulated pressures of a world that does not always arrange itself around the tolerances of the animals living in it, and a season, and the particular winter of a particular year, in which, by some combination of meteorological circumstance and human attention, they all happened to become visible at once. The Swedish ornithologist, who arrived on the cobblestone street in Falköping on the morning of January 5th, with a notebook and a set of collection bags, was doing the same work that the New Jersey ornithologists had done in 1904, and that wildlife pathologists had done with the Arkansas carcasses just 4 days before, and that researchers at the USGS National Wildlife Health Center in Madison had been doing in one form or another since the center was founded. The work is the same across all of those mornings. Arrive, observe, collect, document, analyze, file. The street is different. The species is different. The season and the cause and the region are different each time. The method is continuous. There is a stillness to that continuity that is worth noticing, not the stillness of nothing happening, but the stillness of a practice so well established that it proceeds without requiring anyone to invent it each time. An animal dies, a person finds it, a report is made. The report enters a system that has been designed to receive it and compare it to other reports and place it in a category and file it in a record that future researchers can consult when they are trying to understand whether a particular event is common or rare, and whether the cause is something that has been seen before. In 1904, that system was partial and regional and dependent on the presence of the right ornithologist in the right field on the right morning. By 2011, it was national and federated and increasingly accessible to the public. The record gets longer and more complete with every year that passes. The world it is recording is not necessarily getting worse. It is simply getting better observed. The turtle doves along the Senio River in Fanza were found in the reed beds and along the gravel margin of the river in the first days of January, and within a week the investigation had reached its incomplete but honest conclusions and moved on. The river did not stop being the Senio River. The reeds did not stop being reeds. The birds that had not died in the event continued wintering along the water margins as they had arrived to do, picking through the seed-bearing plants at the river's edge with the patient, unhurried manner of animals for whom January in the Emilia-Romagna lowlands is simply winter, and winter is the season in which this particular work is done. A pied-billed grabe returned to open water from the back of a wildlife rehabilitator's vehicle somewhere along the Chesapeake Bay shore in the winter of 2012 would have paddled away from the release point with the efficiency of an animal resuming a task it had only temporarily set aside. Grebes do not appear to reflect on the gap in their experience. The water was absent, and then the water was present again, and the grebe was swimming in it, looking for small fish in the way it had been looking for small fish since before there were parking lots in Maryland, and will continue to look for small fish for as long as there is shallow water and cold enough months to make the migration south worthwhile. The sparrows in the New Jersey fields in 1904 are by this point well past any individual reckoning, but song sparrows have been wintering in southern New Jersey every winter since well before 1904, and they were wintering there in the winter after the ice storm, working the fields as the ice retreated and the seeds became available again. The species does not carry the event. The species continues. The individual birds that died in the ice storm were replaced in the ordinary functioning of a healthy population by the birds that were born the following spring in the breeding grounds to the north and moved south with the autumn. The sparrows found in 1904 are part of the record. The sparrows in the fields the following winter are also part of the record, though that part was not written down. Each of these events, the jackdaws on the cobblestones, the turtle doves by the winter river, the pelicans on the cold beach, the grebes on the wrong kind of surface, the sparrows in the ice-locked field, exists in its own specific place and time, with its own cause and its own resolution. They are not connected by a mechanism. They are connected by a category, and by the fact that living animals, in a world that contains fireworks and storms and parking lots and January ice, encounter conditions that they cannot always survive. This is not a new development. It has been occurring, in one form or another, across every winter that has passed over a landscape where birds were roosting, and the record of it, the notebooks and necropsy reports and database entries that document each case, is itself a kind of long, patient testimony to the endurance and the ordinariness of the phenomenon. The morning in Falköping, where the section of this story began, ended as most January mornings in a small Swedish town end, with the residents going about their day. The collection and investigation completed, the street returned to its ordinary use. The frost on the cobblestones was gone by midday. The jackdaws that had not been among the dead, the survivors of whatever roost had been disturbed the night before, were in the trees and on the rooftops and along the window ledges of the surrounding buildings, making the specific dry chattering noise that jackdaws make, going about the business of a winter morning in a European town in the way they have been doing since jackdaws and European towns first occupied the same landscape together. The ornithologist's report was filed. The cause was listed. The case was added to the record that already contained the New Jersey sparrows from 1904 and would go on to contain many more entries before the winter of 2012 was done. And somewhere in the reed beds along the Senio River and on the open water of the Chesapeake Bay, and in the stubble fields of southern New Jersey a century before, and in the bottomlands of northeastern Arkansas a few days before the Swedish street was quiet again, the birds that had survived the events that had been recorded went on doing what they had always done, feeding in the pale winter light, settling into their roosts as the dark came on, moving through the world in the ancient and unhurried way of creatures for whom the world in all its difficulty and cold is simply where they live. And the old records from 1904, in whatever archive holds them, the notes on the condition of the fields, The weather in the days before, the counts of small sparrows in the frozen stubble, sit in the continuous company of all the other records, the long accumulating column of mornings when someone arrived, looked carefully, wrote down what they found, and added one more row to the account of the ordinary world going about its life. On New Year's Eve in Beebe, Arkansas, the year after the birds came down, the night inside the city limits was quiet. There were no fireworks. The ordinance was new, and the streets in the hours around midnight held only the ordinary sounds of a small city in winter, a car moving slowly down a residential block, the muffled sound of celebrations behind closed doors, the particular kind of quiet that comes when a community has agreed, without much fanfare, to do something differently. A few miles out from downtown, in the river bottomlands and the flooded fields that edge the highway, the winter roost was settling. The birds had come in from the surrounding landscape, as they did every evening, flowing in from the bare agricultural fields and the low brushy margins of the drainage ditches, folding into the reeds along the water's edge in their thousands. And there they remained, undisturbed, unhurried, moving through the cold Arkansas night, the way they had moved through every cold Arkansas night within the long memory of the landscape itself. The city had not made the decision lightly, or without some administrative effort. The fireworks restriction required an amendment to the municipal code, a discussion among officials about enforcement, and the kind of public communication that small cities manage with varying degrees of ease. But the New Year's Eve that followed the die-off passed without incident. The next morning, the streets were empty of anything unusual. Wildlife officials who drove the relevant roads in the early hours of January 1st found nothing to record. The notebook came back clean. That absence, the clean notebook, the empty road, the undisturbed roost a few miles out, was itself a piece of evidence. The fireworks disorientation hypothesis had produced a prediction: remove the fireworks from inside the city, and the birds would survive the night. The prediction held. Nothing about this was conclusive in a strict scientific sense, because a single quiet year cannot rule out every alternative explanation. But among the people who had investigated the event and those who monitored the landscape, year after year, the uneventful night registered as confirmation. The cause had been identified. The intervention had worked. The story, in its most immediate practical sense, was resolved. In Madison, Wisconsin, at the National Wildlife Health Center, the data from the Beebe event had by that point been logged and filed in the Wildlife Health Information Sharing Partnership System, the database that wildlife health officials, researchers, and in the years after 2011, the general public, could query by species, location, date, and cause of death. The Beebe entry sat among thousands of others, each one a row in a long searchable record of mortality events, stretching back through decades of North American wildlife monitoring. The entry was specific: date, location, species, count, cause, red-winged blackbirds, Beebe, Arkansas, December 31st, 2010, blunt force trauma, fireworks disorientation, approximately 5,000 individuals. From a distance of years, what the whispers record made visible was something that had always been true, but was difficult to see clearly without the accumulated data. Smaller fireworks-related bird mortality events, involving dozens of birds, or a few hundred, turned out to occur with some regularity in the Mississippi Flyway region around major fireworks holidays. They were not novel. They had been happening, and in many cases going unrecorded or recorded only locally, long before a New Year's Eve in a small Arkansas city happened to produce a scale of die-off large enough to generate national attention. The Beebe event had not been the first of its kind. It had been the largest and the most closely witnessed, and the one that happened to unfold at a moment when a resident with a telephone was standing in her doorway watching birds land on her car. The Whispers database was made more publicly searchable in the years following 2011, and the change mattered in ways that went beyond convenience. Before, a mortality event in rural Louisiana and a mortality event in a Wisconsin marsh existed in separate regional records, accessible to different agencies, compared only when a researcher had reason to pull both files. After, the record was searchable by anyone with an interest and an internet connection. Journalists writing about Beebe could query the database and find comparable events going back years. Researchers studying fireworks effects on wildlife could pull regional data across multiple years and look for patterns that no single observer could have detected from inside one locality. The picture that emerged from the accumulated data was quieter than the coverage of the Beebe event had suggested. Mass bird mortality was not a rare aberration. It was, in a statistical sense, a feature of the ordinary world, one that happened with some frequency, was resolved by local officials, and entered into the record without fanfare. The red-winged blackbird itself, as a population, had not been diminished by what happened in Beebe. The species numbers, somewhere between 150 and 200 million individuals across North America, a figure so large it is almost impossible to make felt through description alone. What the numbers mean practically is that the loss of 5,000 birds, even in a single night, even in a concentrated geographic area, registered as an event below the threshold of population-level detection. Annual monitoring through the Breeding Bird Survey, which tracks population indices for hundreds of North American bird species across thousands of survey routes each year, showed no measurable change in red-winged blackbird numbers in Arkansas or in the broader Flyway region in the years following 2011. The population absorbed the event the way a river absorbs a stone. The surface moved, and then it stilled, and the river continued. That scale can be allowed to settle without being hurried past. 150 million birds distributed across a continent, moving through their annual cycle of breeding and migration and wintering and roosting. The number is not a comfort exactly. It does not make any individual bird's death abstract or unreal, but it is a fact about the world that places the Beebe event in its correct proportion, without diminishing the event's interest or the seriousness with which it was investigated. In the winter months following the Beebe coverage, something shifted in how the general public engaged with the question of what cities do to migrating birds. The Beebe event had brought into broad circulation a body of scientific literature that most people had never encountered. Research on how artificial light at night disorients migratory birds, how noise pollution disrupts behavior, how the built environment intersects with the ancient routes that birds travel through the dark. Organizations that had been working on these questions for years found themselves fielding more inquiries than usual. The American Bird Conservancy and the Fatal Light Awareness Program, a Canadian initiative focused specifically on reducing building-related bird mortality during migration, both reported increased public engagement in the months that followed. Cities that had already begun lights-out programs, which encourage building managers to reduce or eliminate illumination from upper floors during peak migration periods, found new interest in expanding them. The physics of the problem are worth sitting with for a moment. Every year, somewhere between 100 million and 1 billion birds die in North America from collisions with buildings, a range wide enough to suggest that precise measurement is difficult, but narrow enough to indicate that the number is large by any accounting. Most of these deaths occur not at night in urban fireworks conditions, but in the ordinary course of migration, when birds navigating by star patterns and magnetic fields encounter lit structures that pull them off course or trap them in the lighted zones around skyscrapers, circling until exhaustion or collision brings them down. The phenomenon is not new. It is simply more attended to now than it was before. The attention, when it comes, tends to produce results. In Chicago, where migration corridors carry hundreds of millions of birds through the city each spring and fall, lights out programs had already been in operation for years before 2011. Building managers in the central business district had agreed to shut off upper floor illumination during the windows of peak migration, typically the hours after midnight in April, May, September, and October, and the results of monitoring programs showed detectable reductions in bird mortality at participating buildings in the years the programs operated. A building manager moving through the upper floors of an office tower on a September night, switching off lights in sequence, is doing something that looks like simple housekeeping and is, in fact, a piece of conservation work. The connection between the switch and the bird is invisible. The bird that does not collide with the dark building leaves no record. The Fatal Light Awareness Program had been founded in Toronto in 1993, nearly 2 decades before Beebe, by a musician named Michael Masur, who had begun finding dead and injured migratory birds at the bases of downtown office buildings during morning walks, and had eventually organized a systematic survey that revealed the scale of the problem in the city's core. By the time Beebe generated national coverage, the organization had been monitoring bird mortality at Toronto buildings for years, had established protocols that other cities adopted, and had accumulated enough data to describe the phenomenon with considerable precision. The Beebe event did not change what they knew. It brought a broader public to what they already knew, and that change in attention, measured in the number of inquiries, the number of new volunteers, the number of cities asking how to begin their own programs, was real and lasting. This is part of what mass mortality events do in the long period after the initial coverage fades. They make visible, to people who had not been looking, a category of thing that the people paid to look at it had already been tracking carefully. The Beebe event was resolved within weeks, but the public awareness it generated moved more slowly and settled into the infrastructure of wildlife conservation and urban policy over years, appearing as new ordinance language in one city and a lights out pledge in another, and a school curriculum unit somewhere else, each instance too small to make news, but collectively amounting to a shift in how the built world relates to the animals that move through it. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission wildlife biologist, who might have stood on a bottomland road on the morning of January 1st, in a quiet year after the die-off, notebook in hand, scanning the reeds and the pavement and finding nothing, that moment of recording nothing, of writing the date and the location and leaving the rest of the page blank, is its own kind of conclusion. Not every investigation ends with a finding. Some end with the confirmation that the thing being looked for is not there, and that confirmation is what was needed. The blank page in that context is data. The monitoring continued in the years that followed, as it had continued in the years before. The Whispers system received its regular flow of reports from state agencies, federal land managers, and tribal wildlife officials. Some events were resolved quickly and locally. Others required weeks of necropsy work and toxicological screening before a cause could be identified. A few remained open, cause undetermined, investigation ongoing, and sat in the database as honest placeholders for the limits of what had been possible to establish. The database did not tidy the record into false clarity. It held the uncertainty where uncertainty existed, and the resolution where resolution had been reached, and allowed both to coexist in the same column. That kind of record keeping, patient, continuous, deliberately unglamorous, is one of the things that makes it possible to say, with any confidence, that a particular event was unusual or was not. Without the baseline, there is nothing to compare against. Without the baseline, 5,000 blackbirds on a street in Beebe could be the first event of its kind in human history, or the 10,000th, and there would be no way to distinguish between them. The baseline is what the decades of accumulated whispers data, and the breeding bird survey, and the Christmas bird count, and the long layered archive of mortality event reports and regional agency files have collectively produced. Not a complete picture. Baselines for wild animal mortality are inherently incomplete because most wild animal deaths are never observed by anyone, but a picture detailed enough to orient the individual event and give it meaning within a larger context. The breeding bird survey itself is worth pausing on for a moment because it is one of the quieter engineering achievements of North American conservation. Each year, during a fixed window in late spring, trained volunteers drive approximately 2,400 designated routes across the United States and Canada. Each route is approximately 24.5 miles long. Every half mile, the driver stops, walks from the vehicle, and records every bird seen or heard within a quarter-mile radius over a 3-minute listening period. The routes are driven at the same time of year on the same roads by trained volunteers applying consistent protocols so that the data from one year can be legitimately compared to the data from another year and from another decade. The survey has been running since 1966. It is one of the longest-running systematic wildlife monitoring programs on the continent, and it is operated largely by volunteers who wake before dawn on designated mornings in late May and early June and stand beside rural roads listening for birds in the strengthening light. The red-winged blackbird appears on breeding bird survey routes across virtually the entire country. It is among the most reliably detected species in the survey's data, abundant, vocal, and conspicuous enough that even a beginning birder is unlikely to miss it during a roadside count. Its population trajectory, visible in the accumulated survey data, is not entirely without complexity. Like many grassland and agricultural edge species, red-winged blackbirds have experienced shifts in abundance associated with changing agricultural practices over the decades, but the broad picture is of a species present in very large numbers across a very wide range, and the Beebe die-off does not appear in the survey data as anything detectable. It falls below the threshold of what the survey was designed to resolve, which is not a limitation of the survey, but a statement about the scale of the population. Out in the bottomlands of northeastern Arkansas, the winter landscape continued on its own calendar, indifferent to what the monitoring data was or was not showing. The flooded rice fields held their water through the coldest months. The oaks and sweet gums along the river margins shed their leaves and stood bare and gray against the low winter sky. The roosts assembled each evening from the surrounding countryside and dispersed each morning into the fields to feed, the daily rhythm of a flock performing the same cycle of gathering and dispersal that had organized the lives of these birds through every winter within the memory of the habitat. The specific character of that daily cycle is one of the things that gets lost when a mortality event is described only in numbers and causes. The roost at dusk is not a simple or static thing. The birds arrive in streams and pulses from the surrounding landscape, flowing in from multiple directions over a period that can last 30 minutes or more, the arriving waves joining those already settled in the reeds and adjusting their positions within the roost in a continuous low shuffle of wings and calls. The sound of a large winter blackbird roost is its own particular thing, not a single chorus, but a dense layered texture of contact calls and alarm notes, and the constant soft sound of wings adjusting against vegetation. By full dark, the roost has settled into something quieter. The temperature inside a large, dense roost of birds is measurably warmer than the surrounding air, the shared body heat of thousands of animals creating a microclimate within the reeds that makes the cold night survivable in a way it would not be for a bird roosting alone. That thermoregulatory benefit, the warmth produced by thousands of bodies in close proximity, is part of why these roosts form and part of why they grow as large as they do. A bird that joins the roost gains access to the heat and to the collective vigilance of its neighbors, the hundreds of alert pairs of eyes that increase the probability of detecting a predator before it reaches any individual bird. The roost is a distributed survival mechanism. Its size is a feature, not an incidental consequence of preference. In the morning, the dispersal is slower and more gradual than the evening assembly. The light comes up over the flat Arkansas landscape, and the birds begin to move. First a few, then more, then the whole vast body of the roost lifting from the reeds in a slow wave that takes minutes to complete. The flock, as it departs, does not move as a single organized unit. It breaks into streams and subflocks that spread out across the surrounding fields in every direction, each group making for the foraging areas it has come to know over the weeks of the wintering season. By full morning, the roost site is empty, the reeds are still, the flooded field beyond the margin is flat and silent, and across the broad agricultural landscape, in every direction, the birds are moving through the pale winter light in their daily business of finding food, the flock dissolved into the countryside and invisible as a flock from any point on the ground. This is the landscape and the cycle that the Beebe die-off interrupted on a single night in a single location, and that continued, unchanged in its fundamental character, before and after. The interruption was real, and the 5,000 birds that did not survive it were real, and the cycle was also real, and the hundreds of millions of birds that continued through it were also real, and the two facts exist side by side without either one canceling the other out. The attention that followed the Beebe event, in its most durable form, settled into a network of practices and programs and monitoring protocols that persist quietly in the background of the ordinary world. In cities where lights-out programs operate, the building managers who participate do so without ceremony. They move through the upper floors of their buildings in the hours before dawn during migration windows and turn off the lights, and then they go home, and the birds they do not know about continue south through the dark. The program records compiled by organizations monitoring bird mortality at participating buildings show lower counts in the years and at the buildings where the lights are off. The connection holds. The work continues. In the Whisper system, new events are entered each month. Some involve species that are relatively common, and the events are resolved and logged without drawing public attention. Others involve species for which even a small mortality event triggers a more intensive response. Because the baseline population is smaller, the threshold for concern is lower, and the same number of individuals represents a different proportion of what remains. The database holds all of them in the same format: species, location, date, count, cause. The format does not distinguish between the tragic and the ordinary, because the distinction is not always clear from inside the event, and because the record is most useful when it is consistent, there is something steadying about that consistency. The long, continuous record of wildlife mortality events in North America is not, on balance, a record of crisis. It is a record of monitoring, of attentive, persistent observation of the ordinary workings of the natural world, including those workings that produce death in large numbers and those that produce it in small ones. The record shows that mass die-offs have been occurring for as long as the record has been kept, and for long before that, and that the world has continued. Species have been lost, and that is a real loss, and the record shows that too. But the record also shows that the ordinary world is enormously resilient, and that the systems of monitoring and response built around it over the past several decades are real and functional and staffed by people who are paying attention. The wildlife biologist in the field on a cold January morning, the database manager entering another event into the Whisper system, the volunteer on a breeding bird survey route standing by the side of a rural road at dawn, listening. These are the ordinary workings of a system that is, in its quiet way, doing its job. The job is not to prevent every death. It is to know what is happening, to understand it well enough, to respond when response is possible, and to maintain the baseline that makes meaning possible when something unusual occurs. In Beebe, the years after 2011 were uneventful, which was the best possible outcome. The fireworks ordinance held. The winter roosts continued to assemble in the bottomlands outside the city. The landscape that had been the scene of something briefly and genuinely strange returned to being simply a landscape, flat, agricultural, threaded with river bottomlands and flooded field. The kind of country that produces large winter bird congregations as reliably as it produces soybeans and rice and the particular flat gray light of an Arkansas January afternoon. The birds that winter in that landscape are not aware of the monitoring that surrounds them, or of the database entry that their January 2011 predecessors generated, or of the ordinance that their presence partially motivated. They are aware of the temperature and the food availability and the movements of their nearest neighbors, and the presence or absence of predators. They are aware of the light, which tells them when to move and when to settle, and when to begin the long migration back to the northern breeding grounds as the days lengthen toward spring. They respond to the world as they find it, within the range of responses their biology makes available, and the world they find in the bottomlands of northeastern Arkansas in January has, for most winters, been sufficient. The light changes slowly through January and February. The days lengthen by only a few minutes each week at first, but the change is registered by the birds before most human observers would notice it, and it begins to shift something in the organization of the winter flocks. Restlessness enters. The roosts begin to show the early signs of pre-migratory movement, the birds orienting their morning dispersal slightly more toward the north on some mornings, responding to internal signals whose mechanism is understood in its broad outlines, photoperiod and hormonal change, and the activation of a navigational system oriented toward magnetic fields and star patterns, without being fully known in all its specific detail. By late February and into March, the winter roosts are thinning. The birds are departing on schedules that vary by individual and by weather and by the specific conditions of the wintering grounds that year. The flooded fields drain or are drained. The bare trees along the river margins begin the first, almost invisible stages of budding, and the birds are moving north, dispersing across the Mississippi Flyway in the reverse of the movement that brought them south in the autumn, spreading back toward the breeding marshes of the northern states and Canada, where the males will claim territories and display from cattail stems, and the females will weave their nests, low in the reeds above the still water. That movement, the whole enormous, unhurried, continent-spanning passage of millions of birds between their wintering and breeding grounds, is one of the largest recurring biological events in North America, and it happens twice a year, and it has been happening for longer than anyone has been watching. The monitoring that surrounds it has grown steadily more sophisticated over the decades, from the paper forms of early bird banding stations to the satellite tracking of individual birds fitted with tiny transmitters, to the network of weather radar installations, whose data, it turns out, can be read not only for precipitation and wind, but for the movements of vast flocks of birds through the night sky. The radar image of a major migration night, when the winds are favorable and hundreds of millions of birds are moving simultaneously across the width of the continent, is one of the more remarkable images available to anyone looking at it, not because it is alarming or strange, but because it makes visible something that has always been happening and was simply invisible until the technology existed to see it. The birds do not know they are being watched by radar. They do not know about the Whispers database or the Breeding Bird Survey or the Lights Out programs in Chicago and Toronto and New York. They know the wind and the stars and the length of the day, and they move as they have always moved, through the dark, following the routes their species has followed for thousands of years, across a continent that has changed enormously around them and continues to change. Most of them make it. Most of them, on most nights, find what they are navigating toward. The winter roost in the Arkansas bottomlands on a quiet night in January. The birds settled in the reeds, the temperature inside the roost measurably warmer than the air around it. The whole dense congregation of wings and bodies breathing together in the dark is not a fragile or a tragic thing. It is a winter roost. It has been assembling in roughly this way, in roughly this kind of landscape, for as long as red-winged blackbirds have wintered in Arkansas. The specific individuals in the roost are different from those that were there the year before, and will be different again the year after. The roost itself persists, because the landscape persists and the birds persist, and the biological imperative that drives them to gather in large groups through the winter months persists with them. On a January morning, sometime after the winter solstice, but well before the first real warmth of spring, the light comes up slowly over the flat Arkansas landscape, and the birds in the roost begin to stir. The stirring is gradual. A few birds shift position. A few calls move through the reeds. The sky brightens from dark to gray to the particular thin pale blue of a cold January dawn, and the birds begin to lift from the reeds, first at the edges of the roost, then from deeper within it, a slow wave of wings rising into the still air and dispersing outward across the surrounding landscape. There are thousands of them. From the ground they are too numerous to count individually. They move in streams and subflocks and loose aggregations that form and dissolve and reform as each bird responds to the movements of its nearest neighbors. The sound of that dispersal is a continuous low rush of wings, the soft collective sound of a very large number of small animals moving at once through cold air.